Not all myths are fiction. Some are faded memories of disasters that really happened, kings who really ruled, and cities that were really buried. They got passed down through chants, campfires, whispers, warped by time, embroidered by poets. But somewhere, deep in the fabric of legend, a thread of truth survived. And tonight, we're going to follow it. So wherever you're listening from, your bed, your couch, your quiet corner of the world, I'm glad you're here. Maybe you've got tea in hand. Maybe it's 9:30 or 2 a.m. Either way, you're safe now. The door is closed. The night is yours. And we're going to travel backward, way, way backward, through the fog of myth to see what was really there. We'll start with the people, kings and warriors who were once thought to be imaginary, until archaeologists and dusty tablets said otherwise. Then we'll step into the storm to see the real floods, volcanoes, and fallen cities that left their scars in our stories. We'll visit the places, the labyrinths, towers, and sunken cities once thought to be fantasy, but weren't. And finally, we'll look at the monsters. Not the fire-breathing kind, but the fossils and creatures that may have sparked centuries of imagination. Because the world is old, and it remembers, sometimes in stones, sometimes in ruins, and sometimes in stories that we thought were too magical to be true. So lie back, get comfortable, let your thoughts drift, and when you're ready, we'll begin. Some say it began with a golden apple. Others say it began with love. But behind the gods and the prophecies, there may have been a real war, a real city, and a real king who watched it burn. The story of Troy, as told by Homer, is full of divine meddling, jealous goddesses, Achilles with his invincible heel, and a wooden horse filled with Greek soldiers. For centuries, people treated it like fiction, a brilliant poem, nothing more. But in the 1870s, a stubborn German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann believed Troy was real, not just a metaphor, an actual city, buried under layers of earth and time. He followed clues from the Iliad, packed his bags, and started digging near a hill in northwestern Turkey called Hisarlik. What he found shocked the world. Beneath the hill were ruins, not just of one city, but many, built, destroyed, and rebuilt over thousands of years. Deep in the layers, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a city with thick walls, signs of fire, and a violent collapse, dated to the late Bronze Age, right around 1200 BCE. That matches the era Homer described. Later excavations revealed weapons, skeletons, and arrowheads embedded in the stones. A city under siege, a city that fell. We'll never know the whole truth. The war, if it happened, was likely smaller and grittier than the poem. No gods on the battlefield, no flying chariots. But the name Wilusa appears in Hittite texts, possibly their name for Troy, and it mentions a king named Alexandu, which some scholars believe is a distorted echo of Alexandros, another name for Paris of Troy. As for Priam, the legendary old king who watched his sons die and his city crumble, there may have been someone like him, a ruler of Wilusa, someone who tried to hold the walls, someone whose memory lasted long after his palace turned to dust. Over the centuries, the real story blurred. It became legend, then myth, then poetry. But buried beneath the metaphors was something solid. Stone walls, charred beams, a battlefield that left scars on the land. So maybe Troy didn't fall to a wooden horse, but it did fall. And that's where we begin tonight. Not with fantasy, but with memory. The kind that gets passed down through stories, until only the shape remains. The truth was never lost. It was just waiting to be found, just like the next one. Before Achilles, before Odysseus, before even the Bible was written, there was Gilgamesh, a king so ancient, his story was nearly forgotten, until a pile of broken clay tablets changed everything. The Epic of Gilgamesh is one of the oldest surviving pieces of literature in the world, carved in cuneiform on tablets, lost in the ruins of Mesopotamia, and uncovered thousands of years later in the dust of Nineveh. It tells the story of a powerful king who battles monsters, seeks eternal life, and ultimately learns what it means to be human. At first glance, it feels like myth. There's a wild man raised by animals, a journey to the gods, a global flood, a plant that grants immortality. But at the core of it all is a man, a real king, one who ruled a real city called Uruk in what is now southern Iraq. Ancient Sumerian king lists named Gilgamesh as the fifth king of Uruk, ruling sometime around 2700 BCE. That's over 4,700 years ago. He appears again in temple inscriptions, alongside the names of real places, real cities, and even real suns. And while the poem calls him two-thirds divine, Sumerians often exaggerated a bit when it came to royalty. Much of his legend might be rooted in truth. Uruk itself was no fantasy. It was one of the first great cities of humanity. Massive walls, canals, temples, all built long before the pyramids, and Gilgamesh may have been one of its great builders. He's credited in the poem with surrounding the city with mighty ramparts. Archaeology shows Uruk did have formidable walls, some dating close to his supposed lifetime. What makes Gilgamesh different isn't just that he existed, it's what his story tried to say. Amid the gods and monsters, the epic is about grief, about fearing death, about trying to find meaning in a short, difficult life. The tablets didn't just record a king's victories, they recorded a man's regrets, and somehow that echo survived millennia. Across desert sands and lost languages, through burned libraries and broken stone, the voice of a man who lived 2,000 years before Homer still whispers in the dark. It makes you wonder, how many other legends started this way? A real person, a real war, and then the slow turning of time. Because next, we're heading west, to the windswept hills of Britain, where one of the most famous legends of all was born from war, not wizards, King Arthur. And while there may not have been a round table or a sword in a stone, there was a leader, and a battle, and a memory the land refused to let go. The sword, the stone, the lady in the lake. We know the images by heart. King Arthur, the once and future king, pulling Excalibur from stone, ruling Camelot with honor, defending Britain from darkness. But behind the knights and wizards, there may have been something more ordinary and more real. After Rome abandoned Britain in the early 400s, chaos filled the void. Invaders swept in from the east, Saxons, Angles, and Jutes, and the native Britons were left to fend for themselves. Amid that smoke and collapse, whispers of a warrior leader began to spread, one who united scattered tribes, who fought back against the invaders, who may have even turned the tide at a place called Mount Badon. That's where the trail begins. The earliest written reference to Arthur comes from around the year 600, in a Welsh poem that calls him a fierce battlefield leader. Later sources, like Historia Brittonum, credit him with winning 12 great battles. No mention of Merlin, Lancelot, or a round table. Just war. Archaeologists and historians believe the real Arthur, if he existed, was not a king in shining armor, but a Romano-British warlord, possibly a cavalry commander who had been trained by the old Roman military. He likely wore chainmail, not golden crowns, rode into mud, not magic. As for the Battle of Badon Hill, that event is widely believed to have been real. Somewhere around 500 AD, the Britons stopped the Saxon advance in a major clash, and for a generation afterward, there was peace. No one knows exactly where Badon was, or who led the charge, but Arthur's name appears again and again in folk songs, chronicles, and oral tradition, a symbol of lost unity, of resistance, of a golden age that maybe never was. Over the centuries, his legend grew. French poets gave him chivalry. Medieval monks added the Holy Grail. Victorian writers added shining armor and stone castles. But strip away the glitter, and you're left with a battlefield, a desperate people, and a leader who gave them hope. Not so different from another man, centuries later, who also became more monster than memory. He didn't live in foggy Britain, but in the dark forests of Romania. He didn't wield a magical sword, but a stake. And unlike Arthur, we know this next figure was real. His name was Vlad, and he was far more terrifying than anything in a fairy tale. The story of Dracula usually begins with bats, castles, and blood, but the man who inspired it all preferred stakes. Vlad III of Wallachia, later known as Vlad the Impaler, was a 15th century prince who ruled parts of what is now Romania. His reign was short, brutal, and soaked in fear. And while he never drank blood or turned into a bat, his real-life legend may be even more disturbing than the vampire he inspired. Vlad was born into war. His father, Vlad II, was a member of a knightly order called the Drakel, the dragon. The son inherited the name and became Dracula, son of the dragon. But the dragon's nest was not peaceful. Wallachia sat between two great powers, the Ottoman Empire and the Kingdom of Hungary. Alliances shifted, betrayals ran deep, and Vlad learned to survive. He spent part of his youth as a hostage of the Ottomans. When he returned, he fought ruthlessly to claim the throne. And once he had it, he ruled with iron and fire. He's most infamous for one thing: impalement. It wasn't just execution, it was a message. Wooden stakes sharpened and planted in the ground. Victims hoisted onto them alive, left to die slowly in public. Forests of bodies lining the roads. Some say 20,000 were displayed this way when the Ottomans marched toward his capital and turned back in horror. Western travelers and Ottoman scribes alike described him as a monster. But in Romanian folklore, he's more complex. A protector, a strict ruler who punished thieves and corrupt nobles. Terrifying, yes, but fair in his own brutal way. Centuries later, Bram Stoker came across the name Dracula while researching a Gothic novel. He borrowed the name, added a Transylvanian castle, and gave his villain a thirst for blood. But the real Vlad lived in Wallachia, not Transylvania. He had no fangs, no cape, and no supernatural powers. Just cruelty, strategy, and a legacy that refused to stay buried. What's strange is how that legacy evolved. Vlad was a man of flesh and bone, politics and revenge. Yet somehow he became a creature of mist, gliding through fiction, turning from ruler to myth to monster. It's not the first time it happened, and it wouldn't be the last. Because long before Vlad, long before Arthur or even Gilgamesh, there was another man who walked the line between mortal and divine. But he didn't become a monster. He became a god. His name was Imhotep, a builder, a healer, a man so revered that centuries after his death, the Egyptians prayed to him as if he'd never left. In ancient Egypt, gods were born from chaos, sky, and sun. They ruled the floodwaters, guarded the dead, and held the stars in place. But one of them began as a man. His name was Imhotep. He lived over 4,500 years ago, during the reign of Pharaoh Djoser in the 27th century BCE. And unlike the usual gods of thunder and resurrection, Imhotep had a job. He was the royal architect, the chief physician, a priest, a scribe, a man of science and stone, and somehow he became one of the only commoners in all of ancient Egyptian history to be elevated to full godhood. Imhotep's greatest legacy was the step pyramid at Saqqara, the first pyramid ever built. Before that, kings were buried in flat tombs called mastabas. But Imhotep stacked them, one on top of another. He designed something taller, grander, and more permanent. The result wasn't just a tomb. It was a revolution in architecture, the first large-scale stone monument in human history. But Imhotep wasn't remembered just for building. He was also a healer. Ancient texts credit him with early medical knowledge, diagnosing diseases, setting bones, even performing surgeries. Centuries after his death, people still copied his writings, still whispered his name, and eventually they started praying to him. By the time of the New Kingdom, nearly 1,000 years later, Imhotep had become something more. Shrines were built in his honor. People offered him food, asked for cures, thanked him for healing dreams. He was no longer just a brilliant man. He was a god of medicine and wisdom, sometimes shown sitting with a scroll on his lap, calm and eternal. That transformation was rare. In Egyptian religion, kings could become divine. Mythic figures, yes, but everyday humans. That almost never happened. Imhotep was the exception. His name even survived into Greek times. The Greeks called him Imuthes and linked him to their own god of healing, Asclepius. He crossed languages, dynasties, and religions, all while never lifting a sword or ruling a kingdom. He just helped, and in the end, that was enough to make him divine. So now we've seen 5 legends, and beneath the myth, we've found something real: a war, a ruler, a pyramid, a healer, a forest of stakes. But not all stories come from people. Some come from fire, from floods, from shattered walls and vanished cities, because sometimes the earth remembers what humans forget, and when it moves, it leaves a scar deep enough to echo through myth. So let's go there next, to the places that burned, to the cities that drowned, to the disasters so massive they were passed down in stories that still shape the world. Some myths are so widespread, they show up in places with no contact at all, and one of the most enduring is the flood. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh describes a man named Utnapishtim, who is warned by the gods of a coming flood. He builds a giant boat, fills it with animals, and survives while the world around him sinks. It sounds familiar. In the Bible, Noah receives a similar warning. In Hindu mythology, Manu is rescued by a fish who tells him to build a boat. In Native American stories, Chinese texts, even Australian Aboriginal tales, the pattern repeats: a flood that swallows the world, and one person who survives. So, was there ever really a flood that big? Around 2900 BCE, archaeologists believe a massive river flood swept through parts of southern Mesopotamia. Layers of silt several feet thick have been found in ancient cities like Shurupak. right where some versions of the flood story say it began. It wasn't global. It didn't cover the mountains. But if your whole world was the valley between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, a flood like that would have felt like the end of everything. And once it was over, once the waters pulled back and life returned, the story would have been told, and told again, embellished, spiritualized, passed down in temples and campfires for thousands of years, not as a weather report, but as a memory, a warning, and a miracle. The flood became myth, but underneath the ark and the animals was something real, something wet, something terrifying. And it wouldn't be the last time the earth cracked open and reshaped a civilization. Because 1,000 years later, on an island in the Aegean Sea, the ocean didn't rise. It exploded. Thera was a beautiful island, ringed with villages, trade ships, olive trees. And then, one day, it wasn't. Sometime around 1600 BCE, the volcano at the center of the island erupted with one of the most violent explosions in human history. Modern scientists estimate it was 4 times stronger than Krakatoa. It tore the island apart, sent ash hundreds of miles, triggered tsunamis that slammed into distant shores, and buried an entire Minoan city under volcanic rock and silence. That city, now called Akrotiri, was preserved almost perfectly, frozen in time like Pompeii. Archaeologists found multi-story buildings, colorful frescoes, furniture, even plumbing. No human remains though, which means the people may have had warning, but not enough to save what they left behind. The Minoans were a powerful seafaring civilization based on the nearby island of Crete. Their art, architecture, and trade network stretched across the Mediterranean. But after the eruption, something changed. Within a century, their cities weakened, their influence faded, and eventually they vanished from power entirely. Some scholars believe the Thera eruption helped trigger their collapse, directly or indirectly, through climate disruption, trade interruption, or social upheaval. And then there's Atlantis. In Plato's writings, Atlantis was a mighty island civilization that disappeared in a single day and night of catastrophe. Many believe he invented the story as a metaphor, but some think he was echoing a much older memory, passed down through sailors, merchants, and survivors. A real island, a real eruption, a real loss. The myth of Atlantis may be exaggerated, but the core of it? A flourishing civilization suddenly destroyed by nature. That part happened, and it left a void, a scar, and a story, one that still echoes. And sometimes the ruins were even older than that. So old, they were thought to be metaphors, until someone dug them up. Jericho is one of those places that feels more like a symbol than a city. The trumpets, the marching, the walls collapsing at the sound of faith. In the book of Joshua, it's the first victory in the Israelites' conquest of Canaan. A miracle, a divine demolition. But long before the Bible, Jericho was already ancient. It may be the oldest continuously inhabited city on earth. Its ruins go back over 10,000 years, and layer after layer, it tells the story of a city built, rebuilt, defended, and destroyed again and again. In the mid-20th century, British archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon excavated the site and made a surprising discovery. The walls of Jericho, massive stone fortifications, really did fall, literally collapsed outward, and the destruction dated to around the same general time that the Bible places the conquest. But there's a catch. Kenyon concluded that the city may have already been abandoned when it fell, possibly from earthquake, not trumpet. and the biblical timeline doesn't match exactly. So while the event happened, the cause and the context are still debated. Other archaeologists argue that different destruction layers better match the biblical account. Still others say the story may have compressed multiple real events into one dramatic tale. Either way, the physical evidence is there. A walled city, a sudden collapse, a turning point remembered not just in scripture, but in stone. And it's a pattern we've seen before. When myth and ruin meet, the story gets bigger, louder, more divine, and in some cases, like Troy, a myth becomes a poem becomes history, and the ruins tell a second tale. We've been to Hisarlik before. We've stood among its fallen stones, remembering the fire and spears. But the fall of Troy isn't just about the war. It's about what happens when memory becomes myth, and then comes full circle. Homer's Iliad was passed down orally for centuries before being written down. And in that time, the real events, a local conflict, a ruined city, became something more. It became gods and heroes, honor and fate. But underneath the poetry, archaeologists have found the bones. The walls at Hisarlik show signs of siege, arrowheads, sling stones, fire damage. A city that fell violently, rebuilt, and fell again. One of those layers matches the late Bronze Age, the supposed time of the Trojan War. We now know that Hisarlik was a real city, likely called Wilusa, mentioned in Hittite records. And in those records we even find mention of a king named Alexandu, a possible echo of Alexandros or Paris. What we don't find is a giant wooden horse. That, sadly, is probably metaphor, but deception in warfare, that part is older than history. The Trojan War, as we know it, may be a patchwork of battles, sieges, and legends stitched together across centuries. But the skeleton of truth is there. The city, the fire, the memory. And even in modern times, myth and memory still mix. Sometimes in caves, sometimes in clouds of gas. High on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, at the center of the ancient world, sat a woman who spoke for the gods. The oracle of Delphi. People traveled from across Greece, kings, generals, farmers, all seeking her words. The Pythia, as she was called, would enter a trance and deliver cryptic answers in a voice not entirely her own. Sometimes her guidance changed the course of history. Battles were fought or avoided based on what she said. Cities were founded, lives were shaped. But what really happened in that dark chamber beneath the temple of Apollo? For centuries, historians assumed it was ritual, performance, or clever priestcraft. And then, geology had a say. In the early 2000s, scientists discovered that Delphi sits on two fault lines. Beneath the temple are fissures in the rock that release gases, particularly ethylene, a sweet-smelling compound that can cause euphoria, dizziness, and even hallucinations in high doses, which means the Pythia's trance may not have been purely spiritual, but chemical. Descriptions from ancient texts match the symptoms: her altered voice, her swaying, her visions. One Roman author even described the smell: sweet, like perfume. Ethylene fits. This doesn't mean the oracle was fake. In fact, it makes her even more fascinating. Because for centuries, the people of Greece built an entire religious and political system around a woman breathing ancient fumes from the earth and listening. It's a reminder that myth often begins with a real experience, a real feeling, a real mystery. And sometimes what looks divine is just the planet talking. But not all divine wrath came from deep below. Sometimes it came from above, and when it struck, it didn't leave visions, it left fire. The cities of Sodom and Gomorrah appear in the book of Genesis like a warning flare. 2 cities full of corruption. Fire rains from the sky. The land is scorched. Only a handful escape. For centuries, the story was seen as pure morality tale, a symbol of judgment and destruction. But in the deserts of modern-day Jordan, something strange has been found. At a site called Tal el-Hammam, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a Bronze Age city that was suddenly, violently destroyed. Buildings shattered, walls melted, pottery turned to glass. The soil itself is laced with platinum, shocked quartz, and high levels of salt. Signs not of war, but of something explosive, something hotter than fire. Scientists now believe Tal el-Hammam may have been hit by a cosmic airburst, the explosion of a meteor entering the atmosphere and detonating above ground. Think of it like the Tunguska event in Siberia, but over a populated city. Temperatures may have reached 2,000 degrees Celsius. People and animals nearby would have died instantly. The blast flattened structures and likely caused a massive shockwave and debris storm. Afterward, the surrounding land was unusable for centuries. Does that mean this was the Sodom? We can't say for certain. The timeline is close. The location is near the biblical Dead Sea region. The destruction lines up. But even if it wasn't the city, the event was real. A city burned from above. A place turned to ash and silence. And then, over generations, it became story. It became punishment. It became myth. Because when something that terrifying happens, and no one understands why, we reach for the divine. We shape disaster into meaning. We call it a message. But sometimes the fire doesn't come from gods or demons. It comes from stone, from sky, from chance. And now we've seen how memory survives through ruins and rocks. But what about the places themselves? Not just cities destroyed, but cities denied. Places called fantasy for centuries, until someone found the stones. We've already walked through Troy's fall, the siege, the flames, the poem. But what makes it extraordinary isn't just that it was remembered. It's that for centuries it was dismissed as pure fiction, a bedtime story, a tale meant to teach honor, not history. And then, one man wouldn't let it go. In the 1870s, Heinrich Schliemann, a wealthy German businessman with a love for Homer, traveled to a hill called Hisarlik in modern-day Turkey. Locals thought he was chasing ghosts, but beneath that hill, Schliemann uncovered layer upon layer of ancient ruins. Not just one city, but several, stacked over time like pages in a forgotten book. One of those layers matched the time Homer described. Around 1200 BCE fortified walls, evidence of siege, burnt buildings, arrowheads in the ground, the bones of a real war beneath a legendary one. That was just the beginning. Later, archaeologists confirmed Hisarlik as the site of ancient Troy, or Wilusa, as it may have been called in Hittite records. The city was real, and it may have risen and fallen more than once, each time feeding new chapters into the myth. Did Achilles really fight there? Probably not. Did Helen's face launch 1,000 ships? Maybe only metaphorically. But there was a city, there was a fall, and the memory of that fire survived for over 3,000 years. Troy became the proof that some myths don't just echo the past, they preserve it. And once one legendary city was found in stone, others started to look less fictional too. The myth tells of a maze beneath a palace, a monstrous half-man, half-bull locked inside, and a hero Theseus who braved the darkness, followed a thread, and killed the beast. But long before that story was carved into myth, the palace of Knossos already stood, sprawling, complex, and full of bulls. Located on the island of Crete, Knossos was the political and religious center of the Minoan civilization. When it was excavated in the early 20th century, archaeologists uncovered a vast multi-story complex with over 1,000 rooms, winding corridors, and grand staircases. It looked like a labyrinth. It felt like a labyrinth. No magic required. Even more striking were the frescoes and artifacts found inside. Bulls were everywhere, leaping through the air, worshipped in rituals, central to Minoan symbolism. A sport called bull leaping appears again and again in the artwork. Young acrobats flipping over charging bulls in what was likely both performance and ceremony. Combine that with a confusing floor plan, oral tradition, and a distant memory of a fallen Minoan world, and suddenly the Minotaur myth starts to look more like a distorted cultural memory than pure fantasy. Knossos may not have had a real monster in its basement, but it did have rituals, symbols, and a palace complex strange enough to spark generations of wonder. And just like Troy, it had been forgotten for centuries, until someone brushed away the dust and found the legend hiding in plain sight. The next place was never lost. It was always known. But its tower reached so high, it became myth all the same. Babylon was real. It was not a myth, not a whisper, not a rumor. It was a city of gates and gods, of mathematics and magic, one of the most powerful urban centers of the ancient world. And at its heart stood something monumental, a structure that may have inspired one of the most enduring stories in the Bible, the Tower of Babel. The actual tower was called Etemenanki, meaning Temple of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth. It was a massive ziggurat, a stepped pyramid rising over 300 feet tall. Built in honor of the god Marduk, it would have dominated the skyline. Colored bricks, towering height, a staircase to the sky. The Bible says humans tried to build a tower to reach heaven, and God scattered their languages in response. Scholars believe this tale may have been inspired by the awe Babylon's ziggurat inspired in visitors, especially those brought there in exile. In fact, after the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem in the 6th century BCE, many Israelites were forcibly relocated to Babylon. Seeing the ziggurat, so massive, so alien, might have left a powerful impression, a symbol of pride, of overreach, of punishment. The tower was rebuilt several times, destroyed by war and erosion, and eventually abandoned, but the story remained. And it evolved. It became myth, a moral lesson, a linguistic origin story. But its bricks were real. Its stairs were real. Babylon's grandeur and its fall are part of history. And across the world, another story was told, not about a tower that touched the sky, but a city that slipped beneath the sea. In Hindu mythology, Dwarka was the golden city of Krishna, a divine kingdom with walls of silver, roads of crystal, and a king who could never die. It was said to have been swallowed by the sea after Krishna departed the earth. For centuries, people treated it as symbolic, a poetic ending to a divine tale. But in 1988, marine archaeologists off the coast of Gujarat, India, found something unexpected. Underwater, stone walls, grids of foundations, artifacts scattered across the seabed. These ruins dated as far back as 1500 BCE, appear to be the remains of an ancient port city, possibly part of the historical Dwarka mentioned in Indian texts. Some parts may have been submerged due to coastal erosion, rising seas, or seismic activity. It's not the Crystal Palace of legend, but it's something real, something structured, something built and then lost. And once again, myth and geology meet. The story of Dwarka may have grown over time, from a king's capital to a divine kingdom to a submerged utopia. But at its core is a memory of disappearance, of a city undone by water. And just like Atlantis or the flood or Terra's eruption, Dwarka reminds us that civilizations don't always fall in fire. Sometimes they sink, and not every legendary place was a city. Sometimes it was a man, coated in gold. El Dorado was never a place, at least not at first. The name comes from Spanish explorers in South America who heard tales of a mysterious king, a man so rich, so sacred, he was covered in gold dust and bathed in a sacred lake. They called him El Hombre Dorado, the gilded man. This ritual was real. Among the Muisca people of present-day Colombia, new rulers would undergo a ceremonial offering. Gold dust was applied to their bodies, and treasures were cast into Lake Guatavita as a gift to the gods. The Spanish, however, misunderstood, or chose to. The gilded man became a gilded city, and then a kingdom, and then a legend. One so powerful that it fueled entire expeditions, drained treasuries, and cost countless lives. Conquistadors scoured the Amazon, dug up rivers, climbed mountains, all looking for a golden utopia that had never existed. They found jungles, tribes, ruins, but not the city they imagined. Yet underwater explorations of Lake Guatavita have recovered gold artifacts. The ritual was real. The people were real. The story, distorted as it became, still had roots. El Dorado wasn't a place on the map. It was a memory, a misunderstanding, and a metaphor, all rolled into one. And now we've seen the cities, the towers, the gilded kings. But not every myth was about places and rulers. Some myths had scales, claws, and fossilized bones. Dragons are everywhere. In China, they bring rain and wisdom. In Europe, they hoard gold and breathe fire. In Mesopotamia, they guard gods. In every corner of the ancient world, humans imagined something scaly, winged, and far too large to be real. But what if they weren't imagined at all? Long before the word fossil existed, people still found bones. Giant ribs in the cliffs, massive skulls in the hills, curved talons buried in the dust. And without paleontology to explain them, the stories did it for us. In ancient China, farmers unearthed dragon bones, what we now know were dinosaur fossils, and ground them into powder for medicine. In the Greek world, bones of enormous reptiles were displayed in temples, sometimes said to belong to long-dead monsters or heroic beasts. The Scythians, nomads of the Eurasian steppes, may have stumbled upon protoceratops skeletons, beaked dinosaurs with long frills, and imagined them as dragon-like creatures guarding gold in the deserts of Central Asia. They had no name for prehistoric, but they had imaginations. And so the dragon was born, not as a single species, but as a universal shape in the human mind. Something big, powerful, and buried beneath our feet. Even today, the connection lingers. A child sees a dinosaur and says, dragon. The curve of the neck, the claws, the fangs. They never really left us. And in some cases, we misunderstood something much smaller. and gave it an eye too many, or perhaps one too few. The island of Sicily holds many secrets, but one of its oldest might have only one eye. According to Greek mythology, the Cyclops was a giant who lived in caves, herded sheep, and crafted thunderbolts for the gods. In Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus and his men are trapped in the cave of Polyphemus, a brutal, one-eyed monster who eats sailors for dinner and throws boulders like pebbles. But there's a theory that the Greeks didn't invent him out of thin air. They may have been trying to explain a skull. The island of Sicily was once home to ancient dwarf elephants. When these creatures died, their bones sometimes fossilized inside coastal caves. And their skulls, they were huge, nearly human-shaped, with a large central cavity in the middle of the forehead. To modern eyes, it's the nasal opening for the trunk. To an ancient traveler, it looked like a single empty eye socket. The rest of the face, the flat teeth, the domed head, felt almost human. But wrong, oversized, mysterious. Combine that with sailors telling wild stories, fog rolling over the cliffs, and the echo of hooves in a cave. And suddenly, the Cyclops isn't just a monster. He's a fossil misread, a memory of something real filtered through fear. And this wasn't the only time ancient remains shaped myth, because in the windswept deserts of Central Asia, another creature, just as strange, was waiting in stone. The griffin is a creature of opposites, lion and eagle, earth and sky. With the body of a lion and the head and wings of a bird of prey, it guards treasure, watches from mountain peaks, and features in mythologies from Greece to Persia to India. But its origin may lie in something far older than myth. The Gobi Desert in Mongolia is a vast, arid expanse, once a seabed, and later a treasure trove of fossils. Among those fossils, scattered and exposed by wind and time, are the remains of Protoceratops, a beaked dinosaur about the size of a sheep, with a large frilled skull and powerful limbs. Now imagine this: ancient nomads, Scythian traders or early Silk Road travelers stumble upon these skeletons. A beaked skull, 4 clawed feet, curved limbs that suggest wings or paws. All of it half buried, bleached by sun. To a world without science, this wasn't a dinosaur. It was a guardian, a hybrid, a griffin. And the location makes sense. The myth of the griffin often places it near gold mines and deserts, exactly where Protoceratops fossils were found. Some Greek writers even described gold-guarding griffins of the East, using details that uncannily match the Gobi landscape. Over time, the image was refined. Wings added, the body made more leonine. But the seed had been planted in fossilized bone. And once again, the earth gave us a creature, and our minds gave it wings. But not all beasts were born in stone. Some swam just beneath the waves, and every so often they surfaced. The kraken was nightmare fuel for sailors, a sea monster so massive it could wrap its tentacles around ships and drag them to the ocean floor. With eyes the size of dinner plates and a beak that could crush hulls, it haunted the waters off Norway, Greenland, and Iceland for centuries. But unlike dragons or griffins, the kraken may never have been imaginary at all. Today, we know of the giant squid, Architeuthis dux, a deep-sea creature that can grow over 40 feet long. It has 10 limbs, huge eyes, and a sharp, hooked beak. And for most of human history, it was almost entirely invisible. Dead ones sometimes washed ashore. Sailors saw floating tentacles. Whale carcasses bore sucker scars, but no one had ever seen one alive. So the stories grew. In Norse and Scandinavian lore, The kraken wasn't just a squid, it was a leviathan. Some said it caused whirlpools. Others claimed it could be mistaken for an island until it moved. What they were likely seeing, or imagining, were glimpses of real creatures in unfamiliar seas. A flash of movement, a body breaching in the fog, a sailor pulled overboard. It didn't take much. Only recently, with deep-sea cameras and submersibles, have we confirmed just how large and strange these creatures truly are. The kraken was exaggerated, yes, but not invented. And if one deep-sea animal could inspire myth, why not another, especially one that looks oddly human? The sea is lonely, and after weeks without seeing another soul, your eyes start to play tricks. So when sailors reported seeing mermaids, half woman, half fish, with long hair and mournful songs, we might imagine something magical. But what they likely saw were manatees, large, slow-moving marine mammals with round faces, paddle-like tails, and forelimbs that vaguely resemble arms. In the right light and the wrong state of mind, they could look strangely human. Christopher Columbus himself claimed to spot mermaids near the Caribbean. He described them as not half as beautiful as they are painted, which frankly sounds like a man realizing he'd stared too long at a manatee. But there's more than just visual confusion. Sailors, especially in isolated crews, often experience dehydration, hunger, and sleep deprivation, all of which can spark hallucinations and distorted perception. A curve in the water becomes a silhouette, a splash becomes a song, and then there's longing. Being at sea for months, surrounded by only men, the mind starts reaching, hoping, inventing. Mermaids also existed in stories long before Columbus, in Babylonian, Greek, and African lore. Sometimes beautiful, sometimes dangerous. Sometimes they saved sailors. Sometimes they lured them to their doom. But in every case, they reflected our own fears and desires. So perhaps the mermaid is less about the sea and more about us. Because the further we drift from shore, whether on water or in time, the more we fill the unknown with wonder. And now, after all this drifting through myths, monsters, and memory, we've reached the edge, but not the end. Because the strangest truth of all, some of these myths weren't just inspired by reality, they preserved it. Myths were never meant to be perfect. They change as we do. They stretch, shift, and shimmer like reflections in water. One century adds gods, another adds monsters, and somewhere in between, the truth slips through. But tonight, we followed the trail backward. We found cities once thought imaginary, kings remembered in clay, monsters carved from fossils. We saw how floods became warnings, towers became pride, and bones became fire breathers. We saw that behind every legend, there may be a footprint, a ruin, a moment someone couldn't explain. So they turned it into a story. And somehow, that story survived. Because myth isn't just fantasy. It's memory with better lighting. Sometimes, the truth behind a legend is even stranger than the fiction. And maybe, just maybe, that's why we keep telling them. So wherever you're listening from, curled up in bed, riding through quiet streets, or simply drifting in the stillness of night, thank you. Thanks for traveling through truth and tale with me tonight. Now let your mind rest. Let the fires fade. Let the dust settle on old cities. And let the monsters curl back into stone. And if you ever find a tower reaching the sky, take notes. Sleep well.